was based on limiting toxicity to fish would have had these rivers in the kind of the 2.5 to 3.5 range. Those are the numbers that are in the National Objectives framework for regulating nitrogen, which is not yet implemented under the National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management. And in the various zones of the Canterbury Water Management Strategy, they are currently, because they're using targets to be met, they have many streams that are higher than 3.8. They have targets of getting down to 3.8 in some of those streams before 2030, which is the longest possible date you can have under the National Policy Statement. And they have other streams which are lower than that at present, where they're aiming to get them down to 2.4.
Thank you. Councillor Scott, you had your hand up. We'll work your way up.
Thank you, Dr. Pearce. Can I extrapolate on what you have just said a little bit? If Plan Change 6 was implemented in the draft form and every farm prepared a farm management plan and was able to show that they were meeting the LUC correctly and were fully compliant, what then? Would that actually achieve a 0.8 DIN?
So, if I understand, let me rephrase your question.
You may.
You're asking me if Plan Change 6 was implemented as it is currently set out in the draft decision, and everyone met the LUC land use class limits, would a 0.8 DIN be reached in the river? And the answer is no. So
may I ask the Chief Executive to put on a previous hat with the planning knowledge and say, what next? What would you do then?
So you would have to look at alternative means of reaching the 0.8. Those could be increased regulation, or it probably would have to be increased.
But if every farm was compliant, who would you regulate?
You'd have to change the rules, I guess. Well, you'd have to look at the this is part of the issue, the linkage between the land use capability and the 0.8 limit. Well, there is no direct linkage, and I think that's the challenge around that's been posed by the draft decision as to actually how you would go about trying to achieve that.
Chairman, can I take another cut at Councillor Scott's question? For the 25,000 hectares of the RWSS, the rough justice number is 625,000 kilograms of nitrogen per year. But I divided that in the flows of the Tuki and the Waipawa over a much larger total area. I don't know what the total area would be, but it's at least 40,000 hectares. So instead of so if everything was at the same level as allowed by the LUC classes in the whole of that upper catchment, instead of having an increase of 1.1 milligrams per hectare, you'd have an increase by maybe 2/3 as much again on top of that. So you'd have 1.8 on top of whatever you've got now. So, that's my reason for saying, in answer to your question, if everybody was emitting at the maximum that they're permitted to emit by the draft rules under the land use capability classifications, aside from the fact that now they are already, the limit is already substantially breached, it would be breached by every bit as much again.
Thank you. Let's get Councillor Pipe. You're okay at the moment? Councillor Barker?
I've got a few questions. Thank you for the briefing, Dr. Pearce. You mentioned before about public debate. When were you asked to come and brief council, and would you have been prepared to come and brief council immediately after the interim Board of Inquiry's decision was put out?
I did do precisely that at a meeting in the Napier City Council chambers, and I don't remember precisely the date. It was a part of a meeting which was to discuss the financial projections, and in that meeting I am certain in my own mind that I explained to all of you councillors who were present that this 0.8 limit could not be met, and that there were wider implications. So this is not the first time that you have received this information from me.
The second question I have is, isn't the issue here, apart from about the tension between the ecological health of the river and toxicity, as defined in the Board of Inquiry's initial decision?
That is what the Board of Inquiry has said, and it has chosen a number which it says is to find a balance between protecting the environment and enabling further intensification in the catchment. It says in its decision words to that effect in at least 6 places.
Sure. But isn't that the tension here? But a judgment between the ecological health of the river and toxicity, having nitrogen level at toxicity, which then enables easier intensification of land use.
So the levels that were proposed by the council are based on toxicity to fish. In depending where you were in the catchment, they either gave 95% protection against toxicity or 90% protection against toxicity. And that is the basis of those rules. And that is what is set out in the National Objectives Framework. So it's not about toxicity, it's about limiting the extent of toxicity.
And is the other part of the ecological health of the river the invertebrates, not just fish?
Sure. So you have to choose something. So the Board of Inquiry had a substantial chunk of evidence put in front of it about what's called the Macro Invertebrate Community Index, known as the MCI. There was no dispute, as I read the decision, about the evidence among the parties as to whether or not that was a good measure of ecosystem health. There wasn't any dispute about the levels that were proposed, and the council had proposed the same levels as indicators. They could conceivably have been proposed as limits.
So it's just that there's no absolutely simple, clear answer to this, is there? That's the point I'm getting to. Some people are making out it's just a matter of science, but it's not just about whether science about the toxicity of fish at 95%. It's whether you choose the invertebrates or you choose something else. There are judgment calls to be made here, aren't there?
Ultimately, in every environmental and economic decision, there is a judgment that has to be made about how much economic development do you want to have within the constraints of protecting the environment. So, and that is the fundamental basis of the Resource Management Act.
I agree. So the point I'm trying to get here is it's been asserted that this is all just about science, but it's not. These decisions are about judgments, which are also about politics.
They are clearly about judgments, and they clearly have implications.
Sure. The other thing next question I'd like to come to is that the presentation you've given us assumes current farm practice. What thinking have you done, and what analysis and forward projections have you done on possible changes to farm practice, and what those changes would have on the din in the waterways?
So I haven't turned my mind to the wider part of the catchment because that's not my job. That's the job of council officers. But if you were to read the conditions that were proposed and accepted by the Board of Inquiry for the Ruataniwha Water Storage Scheme, as again I have told this council before, that set requirements that are in excess of lower requirements in Canterbury at the present time, about every farm being required to have a farm environment management plan prepared by somebody who's authorised by the council that uses best current practices and continues to improve on that, requires every one of those farms to be audited every year for the first 3 years, After the first 3 years, if you've got 3 completely clean audits, then you could be only audited once every 3 years, except that 1/3 of all the farms have to be audited in every year. That there are stringent conditions about zero increase in phosphorus, stringent conditions about modelling the loss, and continuing to use increasingly improved versions of Overseer or another model approved by the council to model the loss. And if the combined losses from farms supplied by the RWSS in any subcatchment were to get within 80% of the limit that was proposed by the council, then all of those farms would have to go back and redo their farm environment management plans and improve their practices and audit until the modelling showed that they would be below 80% of the limit. So my answer to you is that continuously improved practices are catered for in the proposals for the RWSS.
Can I just follow that with another question? I'm not sure if this is where Councillor Barker was heading, but can you see on the horizon something that would solve these issues of dissolvable in-stream nitrogen in enough time to get the RWSS up and running? Is there a panacea out there that hasn't been invented yet, but is on the cusp or something?
So we have made, as part of our submission to the Board of Inquiry, we have drawn their attention to the inconsistency between the land use capability limits that are proposed and the DIN limit, and we have made some suggestions about how that DIN limit might be implemented in a different way. So it's not a hard limit right now, instantaneously, but more generally, other than, I don't believe there's anything that I'm aware of, either here or on the basis of my involvement in the Canterbury Water Management Strategy, that would enable farms to get down to this limit that's been set.
Your views on the 0.8 are quite well known. And there's also discussion in the public domain about possible court action, even from a Prime Minister's press conference recently. Is HBRIC or anybody in HBRIC contemplating a legal challenge to the Board of Inquiry decision?
That's an option that we will consider when we receive the final decision. There are a number of possibilities, but clearly a decision could be appealed on points of law, but we haven't turned our minds to that yet. We are awaiting the final decision.
All right, so making sure I've got a large margin for error, I would say yes to the answer.
No, I said we haven't turned our minds to that yet.
Everywhere. Last question.
Kind of pointless trying to put words in my mouth when I'm being as plain spoken as I am, Councillor Barker.
Well, if you go back, I'll go back and rerun. The point is that if your first part of your answer wasn't as definitive as that, and that you hadn't ruled out any options, so you're not ruling out any options, you're ruling in every option. That's what I took from the first part of your answer. You went and refined it, but the point I make to you, just want to be clear about it. I just want to know whether you were or not, and you're not ruling anything out. If you're not ruling anything out, in my opinion, you're ruling everything in.
And?
Well, it's just what I stand on. The last question I've got is that there were a number of discussions. You heard from a number of people from Wellington whose opinions I have some confidence in, and who I think would know about such things, that there was discussion at some point about the possibility of legislating over the top of the Board Inquiry decision.
I have no knowledge of any of that, and I'm certainly not willing to speculate on any such piece of nonsense.
Well, I just want to ask you whether you've said no, you didn't. I accept that. Thank you.